Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Hey now, today we're going to take a look at the Majority Complete Edition from Ninja Star Games, but in particular, the Majority 2. There are two different games in this box. I did a companion video that featured the first game in the box, which is just called the Majority. But then there's the Majority 2, and the games are quite different, even though they have the same theme of taking place in this sort of demonic assembly of dark supernatural creatures who are vying for power against each other. The Majority was a multiplayer of up to 4 players, and really meant to be played with 4 players, drafting game. But the Majority 2 is 2 players only. And while this theme is the same, if you're trying to get these different faction members and gain control for yourself, how it plays out is completely different. The way that you pass cards from one to another is reminiscent of drafting in a way, but is like nothing I've quite ever played before, and to try to explain it here would not be doing it justice. Let me go ahead and do a brief overview of how this is all going to work. Then we're going to come back and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, the Majority 2 is a competitive game for exactly 2 players. The goal of the game is to have the most points, and the game is going to end when someone forms 5 factions of cards. This game is a set collection game all about trying to gain different factions. There's all these different board members of these different magical factions. You've got witches and angels and demons and dragons and reapers. And you're trying to make sets of these cards, have a representative for each of these factions that are going to give you points, so that when someone gains 5 factions, you add up all of the points of the representatives of their factions. Whoever has the most points together, along with the coins that they have in front of them, is going to be the winner of the game. So one thing I want to note here, just a logistical thing, is that this shares coins with the Majority 1, which is in the same box as the Majority Complete Edition. It also shares this marker, which in the Majority is a spy marker. In this game, it's just a first player marker. And then the coins are going to be used between both games. Now, the important thing here is that coins are either face up or face down. Face down is actually if the coins are showing their numbered side. Face up is if it's showing the witch side, which I know it's hard to tell, but that's supposed to be a little witch head. So if a coin is on its witch side, it is face up. At the start of the game, you're going to get 3 of these coins, and they're going to be face down. You also have these colored discs here, which are going to be used by certain cards to be put onto faction cards that you have out on the table. If a card has one of these markers on it, it is that color. Its color changes. We'll get back to that in a few minutes. Now, out of the board member cards that you have here, or faction member cards, I guess I should call them, each player at the beginning of the game is going to be dealt 4 cards that are going to be put face down in front of them as their reserve. You can look at these cards whenever you want. Your opponent can't, obviously, but they are not technically your hand. They are just off to the side for now. And if you are the first player, then you are also going to be dealt 6 cards from the deck, but not your opponent, because this is a bit of an odd drafting game. The cards that you're using now may be going to your opponent when it's their turn. And if they don't, then they're actually going to draw their reserve. It's a whole thing. Let's just go through it step by step. Now, when it's your turn, the first thing you do is the income phase. This is where any coins that you have, and you may gain more coins as the game progresses, you hopefully will, because it's also points at the end of the game, you're going to flip those coins face up, meaning that they are now active and you can now use them. When you use them during the course of your turn, you'll flip them back face down, meaning you cannot use them until the start of your next turn. Next, you have the exchange phase. This is where you have the option of exchanging every card that is in your hand with every card that is in your reserve, therefore putting all of the cards that you had in your hand into the spot where your reserve was. This is optional, and it's all or nothing. You can't just say, oh, I'll take these cards from the reserve and I'll put these cards back into my hand. No, it's either you take the entire reserve or you take nothing. The next optional thing you can do is draw cards. Now, the number of cards you're allowed to draw from the deck depends on how many formed factions your opponent has. So at the beginning of the game, it's 0, and so therefore you're only allowed to draw up to 2 cards from the deck, or that's how many cards you draw from the deck. But by doing so, your opponent is also allowed to take 1 card from the deck and add it into their reserve. And do remember that any cards that you're adding to your hand will eventually go to your opponent unless somehow you use all the cards in your hand. So that's just something to keep in mind before you take the draw action. You're giving yourself more options, but you're also potentially increasing your opponent's options. Next, you have the free play phase. This is where you can take any card from your hand unless it stipulates that you cannot play it during the free play phase, and you can optionally just play it for free. You do not have to pay its cost in coins as you normally would have to doing the standard method, but in exchange for that, you are not allowed to use any of its special abilities. This one actually doesn't have special abilities, so that's a bad example. But if this were the card, I would ignore its special ability, and it is simply out there. Now, when you're placing cards from factions, you're placing them into columns. You can have 3 columns in play, and you don't have to start a new column every time you play a card. You can optionally just choose to put it onto an existing column that you have. And like I said, if you're doing this in free play mode, you ignore its special abilities and you just have it out there. The whole purpose of this is that you are trying to form factions and have faction representatives and therefore get points and also get coins as well. As soon as you have 5 cards in one of these columns, then you check to see if 3 of those cards share the same faction. In this particular case, it doesn't. That's not the cards that I happen to have. But if they did, then, well, regardless, if you have a column with 5 cards in it, you're going to be discarding them if you have no faction that you can form. But if at least 3 cards of that set of cards were from the same faction, you take one of those cards of the appropriate faction, set it aside, and that is a faction representative. And it'll give you points at the end of the game. And the rest of the cards you're going to go ahead and discard, and that frees up a column for you. And I'll get back to what some of the specific cards do in a minute. I just want to go through the rest of the phases of play. The next thing you can do is a standard play phase. This is where you can play as many cards as you want from your hand as long as you can actually afford them. So at this point, and some of the cards actually have special prerequisites, like you can only play this card if you have this many other demon cards out, for instance. But for instance, if I wanted to play this secretary card that costs 2, Dragon's Party Secretary, I would have to flip 2 of my coins face down, and then I'd put it into play in one of my columns as usual. If I actually had the coinage to spend, then I would be able to put out as many as I want, but again, you have to have those coins available. Oh, and by the way, I'm sorry, I flubbed this. What I should have mentioned as well is that when you form a faction, you're actually allowed to take coins as well as compensation, as long as you have at least 3 of the same faction in the cards that you, when you form a faction, as long as you have 3 cards of the same faction, you will gain an extra coin. If all 5 cards are of the exact same faction, you get another extra coin on top of that. And remember, coins are both currency to play more and better cards later, and they are also going to be victory points at the end of the game, so that is a huge advantage. And the last thing you do on your turn is simply cleanup. You pass whatever cards you have in hand, which might be 0, by the way, to your opponent. Now, if it is 0, then your opponent is going to be forced to, quote-unquote, exchange their hand with their reserve. Because they have 0 cards in hand, they'll have to take their reserve. But you may be passing them a lot of cards, depending on if you drew cards and how many you were actually able to use. Then you check and see if your opponent has 5 formed factions. If that is not the case, you continue to play until someone actually manages that. Then you're going to look at all the representative cards you took from those formed factions, count up the points, and see, and also add them to whatever coins you have, and then see who won. Now, before I end, let me just show you some of the different special abilities that'll just clear things up as to how the gameplay might go. Here's one representative of the Demon's Party. There's a junior representative. He's got 3 victory points if you were to make him his representative. He lets you draw 3 cards and add them to your hand, then choose 1 card from your hand and add it to your reserve. You have the aristocrat, who by playing him just gets you 2 coin chips face down. Now, he has one of those special prerequisites that at least 2 demon you must have at least 2 demon members in your score area, except during free play phase. Score area is where you keep your representatives. Here is an angel. She also has a special prerequisite like that. You can remove all color discs placed on cards and return them to the supply. If you remove 4 more color discs this way, you gain a coin face down. So angels do a lot of like preventative stuff and helpful stuff. The junior card says that any card in your column where this card is played cannot be discarded. The secretary here has no special abilities, but you get +2 victory points for each other Reaper's Party secretary that's in your score area. You have The aristocrat here who actually puts the color discs out. You put all color discs currently in supply on any cards, either in the play area or score area, without a color disc, and those are seriously going to jack up your stuff because they're going to change the colors of the factions and therefore potentially make them not eligible to be formed into a faction. The junior, this is the Witches Party. The junior, draw 2 cards and add them to your reserve. The senior, randomly discard X cards from your opponent's reserve, where X is the number of cards you have in your score area. The Dragons Party, junior, you discard the 4th card counted from your opponent's side of the column where this card was played. The Veteran, you choose a color and then opponent chooses another color. Discard all cards in play of the chosen colors. That could really mess someone up. And there's a lot of promo cards that come in this new edition of the game. Here's one of them. This is the Independent Party. You're actually going to put this into one of the columns of your opponent, and a faction may form for your opponent as a result of this move. So this is just a way to prematurely get them to form a faction, which may sort of mess them up. That's essentially the majority 2. You are going to be trying to form as many factions as you can, get as many points as you can from the representatives that come out of those factions. Then you're passing your cards back and forth from your opponent to you until someone forms 5 factions. Add up all of your points, add up all of your coins, use special abilities strategically as best you can, and then hopefully triumph over your opponent. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. Well, much like with the majority itself, the artwork here is great. I really like it. Not everyone that I played it with liked it because it is an acquired taste, the sort of dark, chibi artwork that Japan has become so known for. But I thought it worked very well here, and I liked the very simplistic graphic design, even though the card quality is not the best, and the rest of the components are just kind of very weird. By necessity, they're using the same coins as within the box for both games, Majority and Majority 2. And because of that, it's a bit odd that you have the face up and face down that is necessary for this game, but it's not entirely intuitive, and it looks weird having the numbered sides representing face down. That's a minor complaint, though. Everything else works okay. It's not the most thematic game in the world. Again, this is a set collection game with card drafting? Card drafting? I don't know how you want to say it for this one. But still, I don't look for really rich theme in these types of games anyways. It's enough just to have great visual aesthetics. Moving on to the gameplay, there's so many interesting things here. I played the first majority first before I moved on to this one, and I thought, wow, that had a great gimmick. The gimmicks in this game sort of, I hate to call them gimmicks because that sounds like I'm really denigrating it. I don't mean it to be like that. Let's call them hooks. The hooks in this game are even more interesting. The whole idea of getting a hand of cards and then having to pass it to your opponent, but in the meantime, being able to manipulate that hand of cards, being able to trade it with a set of reserve cards off to the side, having to make a lot of interesting decisions about whether to make that trade, whether to add more cards to your hand, which, by the way, is also letting your opponent add cards to his reserve. That whole thing, I love it. I love that whole idea. And then how you actually use your coins and how you gain coins and how they're this limited currency but also points at the end of the game, having to make the different columns of factions. Set collection is something I've seen a million times at this point, even in my somewhat limited time frame of being into hobby board gaming. But mixed together with all these different aspects and trying to form these factions and how that can all work out and what it can do for you and the victory conditions, having that all together in a package like this is something I have never experienced before. It's very, very unique. I will never take that away from either of the games that come in this box. They're very unique experiences. The thing with the majority, too, that I do have an issue with, and out of the 2 games in this box, this is by far my least favorite of the 2. It's not a bad game. It is fun, and like I can't stop saying, it's a very interesting game. There's 2 major issues, though. One is that there are screwage, take that elements in this game that are infuriating. They really are. Whether it's I've been the recipient of these screwage tactics, I have been the one dealing them out, and it's very frustrating. There are cards in the majority 2 that will essentially make you wipe out entire columns of cards based on, color or whatever it might be, or by putting out discs, changing them into different colors that are completely useless to you, that you've been building up, that you've been wasting valuable coins and turns building up, and now it's completely useless to you. Or cards that even make you get rid of guys from your representative, your scoring area, that really setting you back. And that is just so frustrating. In other games that handle take that tactics well, you may get screwed by something, right? But you're like, okay, whatever, man. You took my stuff, but at least I'm doing this, this, and this over here and still making progress. This game, when something like that happens to you, when someone wipes out an entire column of your cards, or when someone changes all the colors of your cards in just such a way that you're about to score these columns and get nothing for them, it's impossible for you to get anything for them. When that happens, you're just completely stalled. It completely sets you back, and it's like you're almost hitting the reset button or going back to an earlier save, whereas your opponent is fine and continues to march forward. You have made no progress whatsoever because of that, and so I feel like the game becomes a race to get those bad cards, the demon cards and the reaper cards, before the other player can, or you're trying to stock up on the angel cards, which I always find that type of gameplay where you have to focus on one area just to protect yourself from something else, a kind of frustrating way to play. So I'm not thrilled with that, and that kind of leads into my other issue with the game, which is that there is a snowballing effect here where one player can just get really, really ahead, and it's just an insurmountable lead. And it comes down to forming the factions, getting the representatives, and then getting coins. Coins are not just victory points, but they're enabling you to play more and more and more cards during the game. And when you can do that, when you have a lot of cards, it almost doesn't matter that someone might potentially like make you get rid of some cards or even get rid of scoring cards, because you've got so many other cards you can play on your turn. You're like, yeah, whatever, minor setback. Whereas to you, it's a crippling setback because you might be stuck with the 3 coins that you originally had. So the way all of that works, and the take that elements and just how insurmountable a lead someone can get, is something that really is disquieting for me about this game in the box of Majority 2. And therefore, it's definitely my least favorite of the two. It's still not a terrible game. I do think there's some interesting elements here, and it's one of the few times I would consider tweaking the game myself in order to make it more playable, because of how cool everything else is. The aesthetic of the game, the passing the cards back, the utilizing your reserve, and putting the whole idea of putting the cards down in the column, and some of the special abilities are great. Some of the special abilities of the card are really interesting, like adding more cards to your reserve, drawing more cards. It's sort of a give and take there of how many cards you want to give to your opponent at the end of your turn in order to make your turn better now. All of that stuff is fantastic. I just wish there wasn't those really harmful effects of the game that can really mess you up and just make someone the blowout leader. I don't like that. So it's okay overall. Since this is the second part of the review, I'll say that as a whole, this is definitely worth it. This is a great game, the Majority Complete Edition, because the Majority 1 is so cool, and at least the Majority 2 has some interesting elements to it. So as a whole package, rather inexpensive. Definitely pick this one up if you're interested in this type of thing, or at least give each of them a try. But if you ever have a chance to get them separately, because once upon a time they were released separately, obviously, go for the Majority 1 for sure. Try the Majority 2 first before you commit to that. But either way, that is the Majority Complete Edition from Ninja Star Games.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.